Welcome, everybody, to this session of the C.S. Lewis Society of California Book and Film Club, where we're going to be talking with Eric Metaxas, author of a new book, Is Atheism Dead? Welcome, Eric.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. I mean, people have seen you pretty much everywhere in recent years, and we're grateful for the presence that you have made for truth of various kinds. You're a #1 best-selling author of what, at least 8 books, I think, or is it more?
It could be in the hundreds. Who's to say?
Martin Luther, Bonhoeffer Miracles, I think the unofficial companion book to the Amazing Grace movie. You are the host of the Eric Metaxas Show, heard in 120 cities around the U.S., founder of Socrates in the City, which is that fabulous ongoing conversational event in New York. A big impact from that. We've read you in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Christianity Today, Washington Post. We've seen you on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News Channel, etc. I understand you have an unproduced veggie book called The Boy Who Cried Waffle. Someday I'm going to ask you about that, but not tonight. Because tonight we're going to talk about your latest book, Is Atheism Dead? Which looks like this. A remarkable contribution to obviously a pretty age-old debate. And this book is available where, Eric, just to let people know in advance?
At fine tobacconists near you. It should be available everywhere. I tell everyone for the cheapest price, go to my website, ericmetaxas.com, where there'll be a number of places you can get it at a good price.
Okay, so let's get into the subject of the book. Eric, when I was growing up here in Northern California, I was told to believe that atheism was just the thing that smart people believed. As I became a young adult, atheism began to look more and more implausible to me, kind of like wishful thinking. But I think based on what I've read in your book and actually elsewhere, it seems that atheism has become even less plausible in recent decades. So tell us, is it really the case that atheism is dead or not?
Well, atheists are themselves not dead, and they maintain that they're atheists. But there are people, of course, who believe in the flat earth theory. There are many people who believe many things. The question whether atheism itself is any longer tenable intellectually, I think is settled. And I didn't believe it as strongly as I do, having written the book and having seen the evidence for myself. I mean, I think we have to be clear that there's a big difference between what is true and what everybody believes is true. I believe Jesus rose from the dead bodily. I believe the Bible is the word of God. There are many people who think that that's utterly preposterous. So whether it's true or isn't true, I think right now, when we're looking at science, the disconnect, what fascinates me and made me want to write this book, and I'm hugely excited to get the book out to people, is that the disconnect between whether atheism was plausible or tenable and whether that's the case is dramatic. And it's become dramatic in the last 50 years. In other words, there are plenty of people, there are very few people who still believe, well, the earth is flat, but they're holdouts. I feel the same way with atheism. In other words, there are many things we could talk about all day long. We could talk about things within the Bible that you say, well, that's crazy, and we can argue. But whether there is a God, whether the universe and this planet and life came into existence independent of an intelligent designer, of a creator, I think that question is now beyond settled. It's one of those things that it's some things are so dramatically, clearly true that to say anything less almost is to lie. But most people don't yet know that, which is kind of why I wrote the book. I said, this is big news. And we've been living, let me put it this way. In 1966, the where I get the title of the book from, in 1966, Time magazine asked the question in a very famous cover story, is God dead? The idea being that science and intelligent people are pushing the thesis of God out farther and farther, and probably now the God thesis is dead among the intelligentsia. particularly because of science. Science has made it possible for us to see that everything happened without any intelligent creator. Well, since 1966, rather ironically, the tide has shifted. Since 1966, science itself has pointed more and more and more and more dramatically to the idea that that's not true, to the idea that our universe, for example, the atmosphere of Earth, for example, the suitability of this planet for life, the cells themselves, none of these things could conceivably have emerged, as we've been told over and over, through random material processes without God. So over the years, I've kind of tracked this. I became serious about my faith in 1988, and I started reading books, that made it clearer and clearer that science makes the case for God. The fine-tuned universe, which I can talk about in a moment, is one of the most dramatic, clear cases that you say there's just no way that today, knowing what we know, all of these things could be so precisely fine-tuned, and that if they were ever so slightly different, everything would not exist. The universe would not exist. Most of us haven't heard that in school. For most of us, this is news, and we think, "Come on, Eric, where are you getting this from?" So it was a few years ago that I met two people. I write about them in the book is Atheism Dead. One of them is James Tour. I'll talk about him in a moment. And another is Dr. Stephen Collins, an archaeologist in the American Southwest. Both of them gave me new pieces of information that just made me say, look, I need to write about this. It has gotten ridiculous. It has gotten absolutely ridiculous. Science of every kind, archaeology, these things are pointing so dramatically to the existence of God, to the clear existence, to the obvious existence of a creator. You can argue about the details of who is this creator, and then also about the historicity of the Bible, that it's not merely some collection of folktales, because archaeology continues to show us more. I said it's gotten so overwhelming that the question today is no longer, hey, is God dead, but is atheism dead? And I said, I have to put it in a book, and I want to make it really clear. And I guess I want to be clear also that I don't think that agnosticism is dead. I think there are plenty of people that have a lot of good questions, and we can debate all of those questions. But the one question that to me today seems beyond debatable, beyond doubt, is whether there is a creator. And the big headline, Graham, the big headline is that most Christians, most thinking Christians themselves aren't aware of this. They think, no, there's a good debate. I'm here to tell you that while we've been sleeping, the evidence has been piling up. And I put most of it in the book, and I hope it's readable, and some of it's even fun, to say, no, this question essentially is settled.
That's pretty remarkable, Eric. As I said, I was accustomed to assuming the truth of atheism as a young person. One of the reasons was, for example, whenever I went to school, public school here in California, up above the blackboard, there was always this chart, time-life chart, and it showed the little mini thingies, and then it became apes, and then they became Cro-Magnon, and suddenly they were standing up. And the evidence was right there in front of me every day.
Well, actually, it's interesting, because I did want to talk about this. There are many things that, as I said, are genuinely debatable, right? Even among serious Christians, you can have a debate about, do you believe in blind Darwinian evolution? Do you believe in theistic evolution? Do you believe in intelligent design? Do you believe in the young earth? What do you believe? You can have conversations.
There are some subjects that are subsidiary.
But what is no longer debatable, and that's why I don't deal with the evolution stuff in the book.
Of course.
I deal with the more dramatic question. I mean, let's say somebody says, listen, I understand how natural selection works. I read what Alfred Russel Wallace wrote and what Darwin wrote, and their basic thesis, I get it. They say that over time, animals reproduce, and those animals that just happen by random mutations to have good genes will live longer and will reproduce more, and that over the eons, we're going to get, gnats will become woolly mammoths and all that kind of crazy stuff. I understand the mechanism. I understand the argument. I don't deal with that at all in the book. What I deal with is this, the question that many of us never ask, have never heard asked. And this is what made me write the book. I was with James Tour, who's a nanoscientist at Rice University in Houston. And he starts talking to me about something, as I said, that I'd never thought about or hadn't thought about in decades. And that was, how did life begin? Before it either evolves or doesn't evolve or anything, scientists say, we all know 4 billion years ago, life appears on planet Earth. The simplest life, of course, very, very simple, single-celled life appears 4 billion years ago. But what nobody ever seems to ask is, hey, Mr. Scientist, how did that happen? Because it couldn't have happened through the mechanism of evolution, because you yourself say that evolution requires life to reproduce and so on and so forth. So before there's any life, how do you go from non-life to life? How did that first life emerge? And Jim Tour, he's now a friend, so I can call him Jim. He explains to me, being a nanoscientist, he doesn't actually say that he knows more about this than anybody in the world, but I think you get the impression that he does. He's here to say, when they tell you they have some idea of how this happened 4 billion years ago, they're blowing smoke, they're fudging it. They have no idea, and they may be able to fool you, but they can't fool me. And so he describes to me how extraordinarily complex it is to go from non-life to life, and how most of us have been kind of snowed, because what did we learn in school? Someplace on some test, whether it's in 8th grade, biology, or maybe it was in 11th grade, whenever it happened, there was something on a test. And they said, oh, in 1952, 2 students at the University of Chicago, Miller-Urey, ran an experiment. They put together what they thought was some approximation of the prebiotic soup. In other words, a solution with zero life in it, some water, some nitrogen, a few things. And they said, this is probably what was on the surface of Earth 4 billion years ago. How did life begin? They think, well, maybe lightning struck because of the
I heard this when I was a student. They zapped it and it proved somehow something.
Well, this is the thing. Like I remember when he was telling me this, I remember thinking, yes, this is all coming back. It was on the test. So he says what happened in 1952 is they ran electricity through the solution and they got amino acids. And they said, aha, amino acids. Now, let's be clear, amino acids are very, 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 very far from life. But in 1952, they were naive enough and hopeful enough that if they could get amino acids, pretty soon they'll figure out how the amino acids become proteins and how the proteins become. Before you know it, we have life.
So I thought when I read that chapter that as I kept reading, okay, so 1952, I remember that, hearing about that, but surely by now they must have gotten to actually zapping the stuff and making living molecules.
Well, see, this is the thing. So that was the thesis, and what runs all through the book is Atheism Dead, is the thesis that we have been all, including devout Christians, have internalized this idea that science has all these answers. And what James Tour explains to me is, Eric, he says, in 70 years, they've been working on this problem. In 1952, 53, they were tremendously hopeful. The naivete of their ignorance made them hopeful that within a few decades, we will get it all nailed down. We've got it here. We're going to go to the next step, and the next step, the next step. He says in 70 years, they have not moved the ball forward 1 millimeter. In fact, science, and again, this is the thesis of the book, the more we have learned from science, think of the irony, the more we have learned from science, the more we know we will never figure out how life emerged after you get amino acids. It's easy to think it could happen if you don't know very much. And in 1952, it was very easy. And there was this flush of naive hope that science is going to show us how life emerged without God. And Jim Tour explains, and I write in the book, that what we have determined over these decades is precisely the opposite. The closer you look, the more you see, oh my goodness, that never happened. That cannot ever happen. In fact, the most simple example is right around this time, 53, James Watson and Crick discovered DNA, and they realized that there is this outrageously complex computer code in every cell, not in complex cells, in the simplest cell. And so you now have to say, okay, so somehow randomly, we're going to go from sloshing water, lightning strikes, and how do you get a computer code? How do you get something as complex as a cell? They didn't know that cells were this complex. They were naive, but we now know. 70 years later, the ball hasn't moved forward a millimeter. And in fact, James Tour says that, I quote him in the book, that it's as if we were close in 1953. We were close. But the target that we're practicing our aim, we're going to get it any minute now, any year, we're going to figure it out. He says it's as if the target sped off to the other side of the observable universe. We know we will never come close to hitting it. The problem has grown exponentially, dramatically. So that's the first thing I thought to myself. We never asked that question of the scientist, hey, life, how did that begin? We kind of assume that science sort of has that figured out. And if you ask, I think somebody asked Richard Dawkins once, and he said, oh, well, we're working on it. Yeah, we're working on it. We're also working on turning, lead into gold. We're working on a lot of things. We'll get there eventually. But it so overwhelmed me when I really understood that this is an example of proof for God that is so dramatic that the greatest minds in science don't have the beginning of an idea. They'll pretend they do, but James Tour says, trust me, I know that they don't. They don't have the beginning of an idea of how the simplest life emerged on planet Earth. So it's sort of funny. It's at least interesting. And there are three arguments from science that I use in the beginning of the book, just to familiarize the reader, to say, look, if you know nothing else, these are three basic arguments from science that we didn't know 100 years ago, but now science has led us to see the evidence for God is so overwhelming. You at least need to know these three basic arguments. And then I go on to biblical archaeology, and then I go on to other stuff at the end of the book. Can I talk a moment about the fine-tuned argument?
Yes, please do. But first, credit where credit is due. This is James Tour from page 90 of Eric Metaxas's book. You say at the end of that chapter 6, as I recall, the news of Miller-Urey's experiment was earth-shaking, albeit premature. You say, at the time, it was as though we had done what Dr. Frankenstein had done in Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, as though we had discovered the very secret of life itself. We had, through science, built a tower reaching into the very heavens, and in so doing, we had killed any reason to require a deity. We could get there without his help. But James Tour, I'm reading from your book just briefly, explains two problems in particular have become intractable since the Miller-Urey experiment. One is that the single-celled organism, the earliest and simplest form of life, is now known to be inconceivably more complex because organic molecules degrade rapidly, often under the same conditions under which they were formed.
It's actually, I mean, I'm not kidding. There's a lot of humor in the book because some of this is hilarious, because here you see scientists with this tremendous confidence that we're going to figure it out. But the more they figure out, because of course science has progressed dramatically, the more they figure out, the less clear it is that it's even possible that this ever could have happened. I mean, it does become funny once you know how. So if I were to put together a single cell, how would I do that? The more you know about how you might do that, the more you realize, oh, by the way, this isn't happening. So James Tour, I wrote about him in a couple of chapters because I thought this is the one thing. He himself hasn't written a book on this. And I thought, I've got to get the message out to the world that this central question of existence, how did life begin, is as unanswered as anything. There is no question that it
seems less answered now than it did.
That's the point. The more we know, the more we are sure that we know nothing to answer the question, which I find kind of funny because you say, well, that's interesting. So it seems like maybe God did it, if I had to guess. But the fine-tuned universe, the reason I bring that up is because I devote a good amount of the book to the fine-tuned universe, because there are people, for example, Christopher Hitchens, about whom I write toward the end of the book. he was once asked, what is the most famous argument on the God side of the equation? In other words, if you, if you could be honest for a minute, Christopher Hitchens, which he really often couldn't be, because he was not the kind of a debater who would say, well, I'll give you this or I'll give you that. He didn't give anybody anything. But in a rare moment of candor, he said, well, without any question, the answer to that is the fine-tuned argument, the idea. Now imagine this is coming from a hostile atheist. He wasn't a friendly atheist. He was hostile to people of faith, hostile to the premise of any kind of faith. But he said the most difficult, for sure, serious point made by the people on the God side was what's called the fine-tuned argument. And he said, we, meaning those of us on his atheist side of the ledger, they really had trouble with it. So he was honest about that. Well, when I have written about the fine-tuned argument previously, I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal that went about as viral as anything can go. The attacks all said, oh, this has been dealt with. This is nonsense. I can't believe you're bringing it up. And I thought, well, excuse me, Christopher Hitchens, the standard bearer for your movement, says you're wrong. He says this is the question. So what is the fine-tuned argument? It's actually simple. It's that the more science has discovered. So again, 100 years ago, there's really no fine-tuned argument. But as science has progressed, it has noticed with the tools of science that there are certain things, whether with regard to the laws of physics, the laws of biology, the laws of chemistry, whatever they are, there are things that appear to be precisely fine-tuned, exquisitely fine-tuned, so much so that if they were, a tiny bit this way or a tiny bit that way, the whole thing goes kablooey. One of the simplest examples is the size of the Earth. We now know, and this is funny because we all grew up watching Star Trek, we figure, what in the world does the size of a planet have to do with whether there's life? Come on. Well, science now says, oh, excuse me, if the Earth were the tiniest bit smaller, not like 50%, like 4%, like nothing, there would be no possibility of life. Our atmosphere could not exist. There would be no atmosphere. Our magnetosphere would not be powerful enough, and we'd be like Mars, zero life. Well, they say, by the way, also, if the Earth were ever so slightly bigger than it is, similarly, there would be no possibility of life for other reasons. The gravity would be so strong because the mass is so large, and it would pull down things, making it impossible to have any real atmosphere. So science is now telling us, now this is not the Bible, this is science, is telling us,
yeah, exactly,
that the size of the Earth seems precisely fine-tuned for life. Coincidence? Oh, it's got to be a coincidence, and we're very lucky. Okay, but then they go on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. Wherever you look, there are things exactly like this. The existence of the moon, if the moon weren't the size that it is, where it is, the rotation of the Earth would be so wild because the moon stabilizes it, that science tells us that there would be no possibility of life on Earth as we know it. It just couldn't be. I mean, and I'm not giving
you recount also that they discovered that a planet like this would have had to be within a certain vicinity of a planet the size of Jupiter. Otherwise, there would have been too many meteorites.
That's the funniest one of all. This is the one that kills me. You start thinking like, well, okay, so the Earth is just the right size, and we have a moon just the right size. Well, those are two pretty dramatic coincidences, but what else? What else? Well, it turns out that Jupiter, by the way, is 400 million miles away. The sun is only 93 million miles away. Jupiter is 400 million miles away. It is huge, of course, not as huge as the sun, but compared to Earth, it is gigantic. It has more mass than all of the other planets in the solar system. None of us could see it. I mean, it's one of those things that only an expert could say, yes, I see it in the night sky on a certain night. There it is, a pinprick of light, 400 million miles away. Science now says that if that pinprick of light, 400 million miles away, were not there, doesn't exist, the gravity from that, it just so happens, we now know, pulls the meteors and the asteroids that would hit Earth away from Earth. So a tiny, tiny fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the number of asteroids and meteors hit Earth that would if Jupiter weren't there. And you start realizing, if you know anything about asteroids and meteors, I talk in the book about the Tunguska, Siberia asteroid hit in 1908 that, like 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. I mean, the impact of asteroids hitting Earth, according to what science now knows, if Jupiter weren't there, there would be no possibility that life could have emerged on Earth. I mean, none. And again, we're talking about three tiny things: the size of the Earth, the moon, but according to my research, everywhere you look, there are examples of this kind of design, of a level of fine tuning that's so precise that it's actually frightening. You realize this was designed. It doesn't just appear designed. It would be like looking at Mount Rushmore and saying it's possible that the wind did that. And you say, well, actually,
give the wind enough time.
No, yeah, give enough time. There's presidents everywhere. Just look around. You realize that we're talking about something many magnitudes beyond that. And I said, most people aren't aware of this. And it's only in recent decades. This is what I find amazing. It's only in recent decades that science has seen these things. We didn't have the ability to know these things, even about the moon or about Saturn. But everywhere you look, another thing that's worth mentioning is that 13.8 billion years ago, we have the Big Bang. That's a big controversy, and I can write about that. But physicists all say that the four fundamental forces of physics, which were determined less than a millionth of a second after the Big Bang, those four fundamental values, if any of them were ever so slightly changed, I mean, again, by 0.00001, that type of thing, the entire universe as we know it could not exist. No stars, no planets, no nothing. And you think, that's what physics teaches? Yes, this is physics. This is not, Christian Bible study. This is what physics is telling us. But again, it goes on and on. I'm just hitting a few highlights. Right. But it adds up so dramatically that I said we have to get the word out that science points to the idea that atheism is no longer tenable. You can pick some other idea. You can argue all day about whether you're an agnostic, but the idea that there's no God, I don't think it's even on the table anymore.
A super intelligence is by far the most plausible hypothetical explanation for all of this.
And even when you say by far, that's not even enough.
It's like way. Okay, but look, here's my layman's reaction to this. And based upon people I grew up with, at this point in the argument, I just know what they would say. And then maybe I've said this to you. People have said this to you before, Eric. But so one reaction to this could be, well, think of that. I mean, I am just so in awe of nature, because isn't it really awe-inspiring that with nothing other than matter and natural physical laws, all this complexity to come into, I am just even more wonderfully awestruck with the power of physical nature and physical laws than I ever was before.
Well, I guess that's the point, is that we've been trained to think that way.
Yeah.
And it's like alchemy or phrenology. I mean, there are a lot of good people who thought that, bloodletting was the way to health. We have to be humble, and we have to say, look, according to science, that stuff doesn't fly anymore. You can't. Right. It's funny too, because I write about how folks like Carl Sagan and then more recently Neil deGrasse Tyson, they put out these ideas like the wonder of the cosmos, and
that's what I'm getting at.
They talk about it, and I think to myself, you're either contradicting yourself the way you speak, or you're lying. Right. Because why would you wonder at these are balls of gas. These are dead, inert, meaningless objects. We are meaningless objects. There's no God. There is no life. There's no God. There's no meaning. There's no truth. There's no goodness. There's no beauty. There's nobody. Do you have the guts to see that? In other words, your materialist view, is so bleak. Are you willing to see that? And the short answer is no. Right. Most people want to have it both ways. They say, well, I believe in beauty, and my heart soars when I look at this beautiful cathedral, this sunset, or whatever. Actually, at the end of the book, I write about Richard Dawkins. I mean, he may be a good scientist, but he is a horrible philosopher. I mean, it doesn't get much worse.
Right.
And yet he and some of these other so-called new atheists have been able to get away with pushing out really sloppy ideas. Listen, if you hate Christians, you hate God, you hate the Bible, that's great. Let's have a conversation. But to pretend that reason would lead you to believe that there is nothing beyond matter is preposterous. And I think we have to call them, the time has come to call them out on that.
I think one reason why there's this Carl Sagan type reverent awe at nothing is that the way the thinking goes is, okay, so we know that nothing exists other than matter, and that we know that there are no supernatural forces. But since there's all this fine tuning and stuff, it's so amazing. But of course, you have to go back to the first point. How do they know that nothing exists? Have they proved, by the way, that nothing exists besides matter?
This is, I mean, there's so much irony and so many layers of crazy, right? First of all, science is limited. Science can never tell you why. Science can never tell you whether there's a world beyond the material. So for science to cavalierly, without evidence, insist that there is nothing beyond the material world, therefore only science can tell you anything, is itself evidence-free. You're saying
arbitrary.
That based on
it's just arbitrary.
Nothing. It's completely arbitrary. But what I find telling, Graham, really telling, is that there's an instinct, even amongst the most hardcore atheists, to express wonder, to express awe, humility in the face of nature. And you think, humility, why? Like, where do you get the idea that that's a good thing or a bad thing? Where does that come from? The awe, the wonder, even the desire for meaning. To say, if you say to a strict materialist atheist, look, there is nothing beyond matter. Our lives have no meaning. Let's be honest. Let's be perfectly honest. The math is clear. If it's true that there's nothing beyond matter, and if we got here by random mutation, by accident, it follows logically it's not avoidable. There is no meaning. Right. But then they will say, well, I believe that we create our own meaning.
That's exactly what they say.
That is no different than saying, I know I owe you $5,000. I'm gonna print some money in the basement. Wait here, I'll be right back. You'd look at them, you'd say, wait a second, no, you can't do that. Like you either actually pay me with real money, with, or you're playing a game. When you use the word money, you mean fake money. Right. You can't have meaning. Right. But what I find most interesting is that most people who would say they're atheists, and I would say because they are actually created in the image of God, they can never escape the desire for meaning. They can never escape the desire to say something is beautiful, to say something is wrong, to say racism is wrong, to say that is evil. These things are innate, and to try to escape these things, if you want to be a strict materialist atheist, requires sophistry. It requires what Sartre called bad faith. You have these two mutually exclusive views, because strict materialist atheism doesn't allow you to be in awe of anything. It doesn't allow you to say, I love my children. I love my country. I love my mother and my father. I love, people would say love. That's just, you're talking chemicals. You're saying that you have some chemicals that the species that we've evolved, some chemicals to make us feel this way and that way. So we'll take care of our young.
What's love got to do with it?
Let's be honest. There's no such thing as love, right?
Right.
But they somehow know that there has to be something. But what I write about at the end of the book, and I think this is actually very telling, there are some people who are very cavalier about atheism, people like the so-called new atheists, tremendously sloppy. I was shocked, actually, at their sloppiness and at their intellectual dishonesty, frankly. But there have been atheists, and I'm sure still are today, but there have been atheists like Anthony Flew, and most prominently, Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. They felt strongly we're living in a world without God. They knew it. They said that's just the way it is. But they weren't happy about it. In other words, they were at least honest enough to say, if there is no God, how do we live? How do we have meaning? How do we do life? Sartre and Camus, the French existentialists in the mid-20th century, they looked really hard at the idea of a world without God. And here's the punchline. Both of them, completely independent of each other, Jean-Paul Sartre, around 1980 when he died, and Albert Camus around 1960 when he died, independent of each other, both of them, as a result of staring unblinkingly into the abyss of a world without God, both of them came out the other side, came to faith in God. Now, again, like a lot of the stuff that's in this book, most people are going to read it and they're going to say, wait a minute, what? How come I've never heard of this?
Right.
That was my feeling. When I discovered this, I said, wait a minute, Camus, Sartre came to faith. Why haven't I heard of this? Like, we all had to read their unbelievably depressing books in college. You mean these people looked so hard at this that they came out the other side, but nobody ever talks about it? I think that's kind of significant, that the people who looked the most hard at this question, at this issue, came out the other side. Let's talk about that. And the people who are really flippant about it, like the so-called new atheists, they don't seem to deal with it this way. And so they can happily say, I'm thrilled that there's no God, there's nobody looking over my shoulder. But Sartre and Camus were properly horrified at it, and were willing to kind of deal with what they were concluding.
Here's the thought, Eric. The idea that human beings construct an illusion of meaning. That's a popular idea among existentialists and their philosophical descendants. We're so remarkable because in a world where there is no meaning, we can create an illusion of meaning. But of course, now at this point in the scientific inquiry process, as you've narrated, it looks to me more like what's going on is having constructed an illusion of the absence of meaning.
Wow.
Then requires
that's heavy.
It is heavy. But having created the illusion of the absence of meaning, they then are in a position to construct a so-called illusion of meaning, which makes them much more grandiose than if they had discovered a meaning independent of themselves.
Actually, that's a great point. I mean, it follows with, as I read what little I could of the new atheists, I thought to myself, the one thing that they don't have is humility. They seem, and again, it's almost funny, they seem angry at God. Yeah, I mean, we've all heard this, but it does seem true that they seem angry at God and viciously nasty toward people of faith. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, if you believed that there was no God, where does your animus come from? Here's a question. Why do you care about anything? Why are you trying to convince me there's no God? According to you, our lives don't matter. We come from nowhere. We're going nowhere. When we die, that's it. Why do you have so much invested? Why are you purple with rage over this issue? It doesn't make any sense. If you really believed that there's nothing, there's no reason for you to be angry. But sometimes their anger betrays, to my mind, that they have been created in the image of God, that they are longing for meaning. They cannot escape the idea that there's such thing as right and wrong, and they're passionate about it. So I think it's kind of like, in poker, it's a tell that you say, I saw that. Did you see what you did there? Because now I know what you're really thinking.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, we're going to go to one last little bit together before we bring our participants in who are with us on the call. But the last piece I'm going toward is some of the biblical stuff. But let me summarize the argument thus far. There's no evidential proof that only matter exists. There's a whole lot of scientific evidence that points in the direction of a super intelligence. But then, of course, there's the Bible, which is claiming to be a special voice of maybe that super intelligence. There's a lot of details in the Bible which people have poo-pooed over the years. In chapter 10 of the book, you point to the discovery in 1851 of a stone. Can you just use that as an example of how scientific historical discovery has validated some key things that once were held in disrepute in the Bible?
Well, again, some of this
haven't gone there yet.
I find it funny because, and by the way, I tell, as you know, I tell a lot of stories in the book because the stories of how many of these things were discovered are themselves hilarious, entertaining stories. The one, I guess we're talking about the black obelisk of Shalmaneser. Yes. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, it's kind of funny. There was no archaeology before, let's say, 1850. You just have some of these empires find themselves in the Middle East and they're looking for treasure. And they begin to discover things that they can hardly believe it. They discover the black obelisk of Shalmaneser. Here is something that's been lying under the sands for millennia that corroborates what took place as described in the Bible. And so for the first time, you have something outside the Bible corroborating exactly what the Bible says as history. And that is only the first example. From that point on, the race was on.
Oh, there are loads of them.
It is almost comical to me. A lot of this stuff, I'm just delighted, and I do find it funny. They continue to find the most obscure things point to the historicity of the scripture. And the most dramatic for me, what made me write the book, kind of like with James Tour, when I met Dr. Stephen Collins, who's a biblical archaeologist in Albuquerque, somebody said, oh yeah, he discovered biblical Sodom. And I said, what? What are you talking about? Sodom and Gomorrah, that's 1700 BC. I mean, we're talking about the mists of prehistory. There's no way some archaeologist discovered this. Well, I looked into it. And first of all, I was astonished that, yes, he had absolutely, without question, this is not like Noah's Ark or something where, hey, we've got questions and let's see. He discovered biblical Sodom, destroyed every detail from the scripture. It's astonishing. But then the further astonishment is, why haven't I heard of this? How come nobody has heard of this? Because this happened in 2010, whatever he's been doing the excavation. This is not something that happened 10 minutes ago. How come we haven't read about this? How come this hasn't been above the fold? New York Times, Washington Post. This is huge news. Science and archaeology corroborating the first few pages of the Bible. And so I said, I've got to put it in a book. People need to know that, you know, if God is the God of reality, which he is, the facts are on our side. It's only a matter of time before science and archaeology and anything else proves who God is. I mean, I think the proof has already been made. The question is, will people be able to deal with it? Because just because something's true doesn't mean people will accept it. They may find a way to wriggle out, like saying stuff like, well, I create my own meaning or whatever. You know, people can just say something and smash it away, or the multiverse theory, really preposterous pseudo theories, but it manages to shut people up, and then they kind of walk on and continue to think that it's intellectually okay to be an atheist. But I hope my book will make it possible for anybody who wants to be intellectually honest to see that it's no longer intellectually tenable. So you've got to think it through.
It's amazing, really, on the biblical side, so many details that you enumerate in that part of the book, which is like maybe the third quarter of the book, I guess, or second.
It's the middle third. The first part is science. The second part is biblical archaeology. And then I go into a number of other things.
So those details, I mean, if objective historical and archaeological inquiry discover many, many ways in which biblical narrative is corroborated independently, suddenly it's no longer because the Bible tells me so.
That's the point. And that's what's, I think, listen, if somebody wants to know whether God exists, whether the Bible is true, ladies and gentlemen, you've waited long enough. The evidence is in. It's overwhelming. Are there questions? Of course there are questions. There are questions about science. There are questions about, we will always have questions, but the basics are there. And it's funny that in our lifetime, we could say such a thing, but I think we have to be honest. We have to stop pretending, well, who's to say? Science has said.
Just as a reminder, for those who may have joined in late, we are talking with Eric Metaxas about his new book, Is Atheism Dead? There's an image of the book, and grateful for what you've contributed to this conversation thus far, Eric. We do have a number of friends who are on the call with us, who I'm sure by this point are champing at the bit to offer some questions. So let me invite our friends who are with us on the call to open their cameras and their mics. Let me begin with David Thoreau. David Thoreau is actually the president of the C.S. Lewis Society of California. Welcome, David.
Great to be here.
Glad you're here. I know that you've been following this conversation with avid interest. It's been a lot of fun, and I've been hogging all the fun. Let me give you a shot at this, David. Do you have some comment or question for Eric Metaxas on this book?
Well, one thing I was going to mention that Eric knows is the third world-renowned atheist that he mentions in the book, Anthony Flew, who is actually one of our fellows at the Independent Institute, on higher education. The issue that converted him to believe in God was also the fine-tuning argument.
Yes.
And he wrote a book about it that Eric talks about. My question to Eric is sort of twofold, and it relates to what is true and real. So the materialist reductionist view is that only energy, matter, and the laws of physics exist. But the laws of physics are not matter or energy. They're ideas, and they're fixed. They've been fixed since the Big Bang, as you pointed out. So the question is, if everything evolves, why is it that the laws of physics do not change either? And if they don't change, what keeps them in place? Is there another law? What holds that law in place?
That's the whole thing. I mean, this is why I find the whole thing's sort of funny. That we talk about the laws of physics. Where did they come from? Why are they immutable? And by the way, why do they work? Why have they given us this universe? And why does math correspond to the physical world? All of these things are impossibly beautiful questions to ask of people who don't share our worldview, to say, what do you make of this? And I think part of the reason I wrote the book, David, is because I think we have to push our side more. We have to stop pretending like, who are we? We don't really have anything to say. Maybe we can answer your questions. Honestly, they ought to answer our questions. How can you possibly believe what you do? Did you have a bad experience as a kid with somebody in the church? In others, what gave you this dramatic animus against what seems at least overwhelming? I think the onus at this point is on those who would say there is no God. I frankly find it indefensible. If you want, again, to say, I have problems with the God of the Bible, I have problems with the people who identify with the God of the Bible, that's a fair conversation.
That's a very fair.
But the question whether there is a God, I think they're in trouble. I also don't want to forget to say that many of us, including serious Christians, have bought into this idea that somehow science is at odds with faith. That is as ridiculous as 1 + 1 might not equal 2. We would not have science. We would not have modern science and the scientific revolution without Christian faith. Almost everyone who gave us science were devout Christians. So that's another lie that we have sort of bought into. We bought into this Enlightenment worldview. It's just wrong. It's flat out wrong. And we need to let people know, excuse me, that's wrong.
Right. And it's true with Newton and Kepler and Copernicus, and even in the 20th century with Heisenberg. I mean, Heisenberg and his uncertainty principle, a lot of existentialists and others believed that what that meant was that nothing was certain, but that's not what Heisenberg was saying. He was saying the uncertainty principle is certain, and he was a theist. Anyway, the other part of my question, which sort of relates to that, is materialists can't really explain free will and consciousness and objective truth and so on and so forth. And we're admirers of the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who, if you go back to C.S. Lewis, in his book Miracles, he has a few chapters in which he critiques atheism or materialism or naturalism, basically showing that it's incoherent and self-refuting. And then Plantinga takes that to a great extent and has developed what some people, what he called and others people consider to be one of the best arguments against materialism, which is the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And so in your book, in the last third, you sort of go in and out about those questions, but I was wondering what your view of Plantinga was.
Well, I'm not going to pretend I'm as smart as you think I might be. I know a little bit about Plantinga.
Yeah.
I mean, I wrote this book. I write all my books on a popular level for people who are not familiar with the stuff. I'm smart enough to read books by scientists and maybe explain what they're saying, but I'm myself not a scientist nor a philosopher. So I don't really want to comment on Plantinga, but I do want to say that the stories that are in this book, even the story, I start the book with the story of the discovery that the universe has a beginning. These are entertaining stories. When you just look at human beings, flawed human beings, trying to figure these things out, and how even the great Albert Einstein was so insecure, he bought into the idea that science is at odds with faith. When he comes to the conclusion from his equations that the universe had a beginning, he thinks, oh, no, I can't say that. So if you've ever felt insecure about saying something, you think, I'm in good company. Albert Einstein was way too insecure about his status as a scientist to go where the facts led. I guess I find all this funny, but anyway, I'll leave it at that.
One thing comes to mind is, there's a well-known psychologist named Paul Vitz from NYU, whose book, The Psychology of Atheism, is really a fascinating study on great atheists. And he delves into the psychological histories and discovers all these troubled relationships with their fathers, which he hypothesizes may have been a compulsive factor in their commitment to an increasingly implausible atheism.
I almost wrote, I know Paul Vitz personally, I haven't seen him in a few years, but I almost wrote about that in this book, but the book was getting long.
Yeah.
But I thought that that's important to talk about and to ask, why would somebody go forward with a preposterous thesis when the evidence more and more, and now I think indubitably says that we need to dismiss the thesis.
So we've also got another one of our friends here at the C.S. Lewis Society of California, Paul Ashby, on the call with us. Paul, let me give you a chance at this. I know you have some interesting thoughts.
By the way, Eric, Paul is a nano scientist at Lawrence Berkeley.
Hey, Eric. So yeah, it's great to have you.
Are you just saying that to frighten me? What is your point?
No,
that's good to hear. That's
like James Tour.
Right.
Yeah. So work similar to James Tour. Yeah. I actually don't want to start with one of the ones from the Origin of Life section. I wanted to start with the archaeology, and just what a pleasure it was to read through that section. And you keep asking the question, why have we not heard about this? And I was asking that of myself, like, why have I not heard about this? Like, why is this not being taught in our churches or anything like that?
At least in our churches, right? We can at least start there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then, as it was unfolding, and you were actually describing some of the scientific details of the investigation that they did into the airburst event, that made me really curious. I'm like, I want to look this up, and let me share my screen really fast. I'll show you. They had a paper that just came out.
While you're looking for it, I'll just describe. I'll say that Nature magazine, of course, a peer-reviewed journal, wrote about what happened 1,700 years ago to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. It is the fact that Nature, and I'm so glad that you're sharing it, this is 21 scientists, obviously not believers that I know of, who decided to use their genius to examine what happened. And it is just, it's astonishing. It's absolutely astonishing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This is an amazing paper. It is a total tour de force. It's the longest paper I've ever seen, totaling like over 50 pages.
Yeah.
And the amount of detail that they give on their nanoscale characterization of materials to prove all the different ways that this was an airburst event is just incredible.
And just to explain what that means for folks tuning in, this is the point, is that this archaeologist discovers at the level of about 1700 BC, he discovers this layer about 5 feet deep of soot with tiny, tiny bits of melted brick and melted human bone. And no one had ever seen anything like it. It was just incomprehensible. So you have all of these world-class scientists descending to figure out what happened. And they come up with, they say there's only one explanation: a cosmic airburst event. A meteor about 180 feet in diameter enters the Earth at about 35,000 miles an hour, explodes just as over Siberia in 1908, about 1,000 Hiroshima bombs at once. There is no other explanation. They say that's what happened in this place
They even
4
put it in the
millennia
abstract right
ago.
there.
Yeah, how about
Yeah.
that?
As written down in the oral tradition. Just
Yeah, and that's
My
in
gosh.
nature. I mean,
that's
that's
in
not,
nature.
biblical archaeology review.
And one of the things I'm struck by is I know that Holland's book came out many years ago. And so, hopefully that would be getting more press. But at least in the scientific world, this paper only came out a few months ago.
Right.
Oh, wow.
Although I want to be clear that, I mean, I write about all of this on a popular level in my book, but Dr. Collins has written an entire book on this, and it's wonderfully written, and I recommend it.
Well, Paul has us on the archaeology. Can you just give us a tidbit, please, Eric, about the stone where Jesus stood before Pilate?
Well, this is stuff, I mean, this is stuff that I learned through talking to some friends, but you can hardly believe it. When I heard this, I said, this can't be right. This is amazing. But it seems clear, and you can read my account of it in the book, that they found the very place. I mean, I should be clear that, if you visited Jerusalem, there are tours and they'll show you where supposedly these things happen, but they have changed now, and they now believe that they have the actual place where Jesus would have stood bleeding with the crown of thorns, the actual bema seat, the wooden seat where Pilate would have sat. I mean, this is incomprehensible, but archaeology and science more and more and more are revealing things like this. The one thing that I still can't believe is the discovery. I mean, this sounds like I'm making it up. Like they discovered, Santa's workshop at the North Pole. Well, they've discovered in Nazareth what is obviously the first century home of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And again, you think that's not possible. Why wasn't that written about? I write about why these things aren't written about, specifically that in the book, because I find that as fascinating as the story of the discovery itself. The idea of how people go out of their way not to mention this because maybe they're afraid, they'll lose some, their career will suffer.
Research grants. We've got Andrew Dosa with us, also another friend of the C.S. Lewis Society of California. Andrew, would you like a chance to ask a question or make a comment with Eric?
Sure, Eric. I just wanted to begin by saying that we wanted to warm you up with Paul, and I, like him, also have a science background, a true hard science, political science, so you could probably guess where I went with that. So with the idea of argument or apologetics, really dialogue, what suggestions do you have about how we can engage someone who is resistant to logical or rational arguments? And, I'll just say as an attorney, I know people come up with all sorts of justifications for getting stuck where they are despite evidence and truth. So what suggestions do you have for us engaging people with this information?
Well, that's a great question. And it brings up C.S. Lewis himself. Just because something is true, just because something's logical, does not mean somebody's going to listen to it and go, oh, I didn't know that. Thank you very much. I believe. That's not the way it works. We are sinners. We need acts of sovereign grace to orient us to the truth. And so I think sometimes, for me at least, I think a softer sell is important to say to somebody. I mean, some people think, oh, I'm going to get this book as Atheism Dead. I'm going to give it to my atheist neighbor. I'm going to give it to my atheist cousin. And I think, well, I don't know about that. In other words, I think that if somebody is really wedded to a way of seeing things, you can't say, hey, read this, and it'll make mincemeat of your arguments. I think we have to be wise and gentle, and we have to understand that sometimes if you can be a little bit oblique, if you can just say to somebody, here's an interesting book, I wonder what you make of it, I found it entertaining, rather than put the pressure on them that, hey, this is going to show you what I've been telling you for all these years and you're too stubborn. I think we have to really respect people enough to let them come to these conclusions on their own. That's a mistake Christians have often made. If we're belligerent with our ideas, we can drive people away from the truth, which is horrifying. There's nothing worse than driving someone away, thinking that I must argue them into the kingdom. You cannot argue them a millimeter forward or backward. God has to has to help them to see the truth, so we can facilitate it. And I try to do that in much of my writing and my speaking. But I think we have to be wary of the idea that we've got the silver bullet, here it is. In a funny way, the real reason I wrote this book is Atheism Dead. It has more to do with the church. I think that people who already basically subscribe to these ideas need to be armed with this information to know that what you believe is dramatically true. The evidence is overwhelming. And you can stop worrying that if some atheist asks you a question, what if I get it wrong? Well, who cares? The stones themselves will cry out if you cease to have a voice. And in fact, that's the middle part of the book, is called The Stones Will Cry Out. Archaeology itself will attest to the truth of the Bible. We have to stop acting as though it's on us. There's something hubristic about that. It's human nature for us to do that. But I said, and I've always believed this, and people have seen my Socrates in the City conversations, that looking for the truth ought to be fun. It ought to be delightful. We can be as little children in that as well. Chesterton talks about this. The search for truth, the wonder at things, is an important apologetic. And so I think that that's one of the reasons I wrote this book. I said, I think we need to stop acting as though we can just prove it. Here are the facts. But the stories and the process helps people kind of come alongside us eventually. And then, we have to be sensitive to God's leading and how we follow up.
I would just comment on that subject, Eric, that I have, been in those conversations many times over the years. I wouldn't myself say that somehow, and I don't think this is what you're saying, but I certainly wouldn't say that unless there's a inexplicable supernatural zap from God, people can never evaluate the evidence and come to the truth. I would say rather what I've seen much more often is that people pray for one another and God works his way, restoring sometimes to people the ability to look objectively at evidence, which they have lost. And then when they get to that point of being restored in their reasoning ability, their objective rational capacities, then all this evidence becomes relevant. But before they get to that point, if they are just dug down into an irrationalism, the evidence won't help.
I agree wholeheartedly. Very, very well put.
Yeah. And talking about being gentle with atheists, when I was pondering your choice of, with which atheist converts to present in the book, I was like, well, why those and not others? And especially in contrast to Christopher Hitchens, I was thinking, well, what about Peter Hitchens? And so, I looked up, him talking about Christopher. And one of the things that he says is, I would think that most educated atheists are much more likely to be suddenly ambushed in the heart by poetry than they ever are likely to be converted by reasoned argument.
That's exactly why I brought up C.S. Lewis, and I forgot to follow up on that. But look what Lewis does. What greater apologetic, what more beautiful apologetic than the Narnia stories, than the space trilogy. And it's obvious that Lewis himself was converted that way. On the one hand, there's logic, and on the other hand, there are the Norse sagas. Balder the Beautiful is dead. Why did that touch his heart? What sense did it make that pierced his heart? And that was a clue to him somehow. And of course, Tolkien and Dyson that evening, kind of went in for the kill, I guess. But these things are processes, and I think we have to understand that sometimes it is poetry and story. It is those things. And it's why I revere Lewis, as you all do, because he understood that side of it.
Add a thought, which is when I have known somebody, I found it was better. I was more effective at talking with them with two things. One, because I knew them. And so therefore I could share what might have an impact on them. In other words, I knew my audience. And the other thing is, I think we sometimes get stuck thinking that the only successful evangelist is the one who hears them fall on their knees. And the reality is, I think it's a whole lot saner for us to think that we're planting seeds, because one little step might be important. And then it may be another 1,000 steps before there's something significant. But one step that I may contribute to by saying something thoughtful or wise or encouraging is much more important, because I'm not going to be able to hang out with somebody for months and months and months. I may just have a window of opportunity one time.
Exactly.
Let's turn back to David Thoreau. I know he has a couple more things that he'd like to discuss.
Well, the only thing I was going to ask Eric about is you cover so much material. The book is so rich, so well written. It's a joy to read. There's a lot of fun in it. And of course, it's very compelling as far as the subject matter. And you could talk about, well, today scientists have discovered over 200 fine-tuned aspects of the universe, and that continues to expand. But in your work, Eric, and you've been involved in this in many different ways. By the way, just as an aside, I understand that the Bonhoeffer book is likely to become a film. Is that right?
It is absolutely becoming a film. We finally finished raising close to $20 million. It's a long process. We have a glorious script, which took years, to get it just right. And that's a good example of it's an apologetic. It's the life of someone that is so compelling that I think your average person, if they either read my book or I hope see this movie, which we will be making this year, they will say, I think maybe I've missed something. That's so beautiful. It's so compelling. Maybe this God thing is not what I thought it was. So I, obviously, having written 3 major biographies, I do think that sometimes those stories are the most compelling.
That's right. But I do think having, to back it up or to deal with people who are looking for answers, this book is irreplaceable. And so the only other question I had was, if there was just one thing in the book that you felt was the most compelling for you, what would it be?
Well, there's probably no answer to that, but one thing I haven't mentioned is the apologetic of beauty. The idea of beauty. What is it about beauty that moves us? My father, who is now, he'll be 95 this year, but he always says the most beautiful experience he ever had in his life occurred in 1943 in the summer when he was 16 years old. He was in the plaza of the main town of Argostoli on the island of Cephalonia, where our family's been from for generations. And the island was occupied. This Greek island was occupied by Germans and Italians. And he and his teenage friends are sitting in the square. It's midnight. The moon is out. And he said, somewhere from some rooftop, someone started playing a trumpet. And a friend of his knew that it was Ticelli's Serenade. And it was this glorious trumpet music in the middle of this moment, in the middle of war. And he says people just started weeping. They didn't know at the time that the trumpet player was a German soldier, which makes it even more poignant.
Wow.
But I thought to myself, a materialist view says that's just notes. They're not even notes. There's just sound. It's just vibrations, sound vibrations.
Right.
The idea that should have meaning, that should move people to tears, that it should move people to think about the horror and the inhumanity of war, and how we would all like to move past this brokenness back to peacetime to see our families. The idea that those notes could do that, and that they linger with my father almost 80 years later as the most beautiful thing he'd ever experienced. I thought that's an apologetic for meaning, which is an apologetic for truth. And so I write about those things as well in the book, because I think that that's how most of us think. We don't just look at science. We don't just look at archaeology. We look at a number of things to try to make sense of the universe. And obviously Lewis did it better than anyone. But I thought that moment right near the end of the book, of where beauty speaks so powerfully, tells us there has to be something beyond this world. There just has to be. I know there is. The question is, can I find it? Can I communicate with it? That's the question that I think at the end of everything we all have.
Right, exactly.
Absolutely. You were talking about the process by which people evaluate things and so forth. I mentioned earlier that I was raised to be an atheist by my mother, who was raised to be an atheist. Both my mother and grandmother were UC Berkeley grads. My mother could never walk into a cathedral without crying. She was so moved. And ultimately, I think that made a difference. I gave her, I think my first time I gave her a C.S. Lewis book was, I think, in 1973. And then in 2010, at age 84, she finally changed her mind and said yes to there being a God and to being specifically Christ, the Son of God. So it took 37 years. Uh, and I was grateful for all the influences, and I'm glad I didn't give up.
Wow.
Praise God that he moves. I was struck by, the story about Sartre and Camus, that they were almost, deathbed conversions. And it reminded me of Tolstoy's story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, that, there's kind of like this theme or archetype that this is a common experience by people. You even mentioned in the book, like it's death that kind of refocus us and purifies our thoughts.
Well, it's the opposite of what people say. I mean, people like Christopher Hitchens, who was very nasty about it, the idea that at the end of life, people are addled and that's not me. That's completely wrong. When you have nothing to lose, when you are facing eternity, only then do most people have the guts to see things as they are and not be afraid to talk about it. I find that really interesting, because we're worried about our careers, we're worried about our friends. When you are facing death alone, maybe for the first time in your life, you have the freedom to think clearly. And in the cases of Camus and Sartre, the most implausible candidates, both of them come to faith. I mean, if I did nothing else in this book but tell those two stories, I thought the world needs to know.
And we do not yet know what will happen with Dennett and Harris and Dawkins. Pray that God moves them.
Yeah.
Well, any more from you, David, before we turn the corner?
No, I think this was wonderful, and thank you all, and thank you, Eric. We're big admirers of you and your work, and just keep it up.
Yeah, keep up the good work.
I mean, that means a lot to me. Thank you for letting me be a part of this. I appreciate it.
Let me just point out to our friends who are with us that there is a way to stay in touch with Eric Metaxas, ericmetaxas.com, and then you've got the Twitter and Facebook and so forth. And you can receive email updates by going to this, text Eric M at that number. So I invite you to keep in touch with Eric Metaxas. And of course, I do invite you to take a look at his book, Is Atheism Dead? And I will show you the book one last time here before we go. This book is worth seeking out in the bookstore. Is Atheism Dead? You can get it from ericmetaxas.com, also probably from other booksellers. I think, Eric, am I right?
Well, if you go to ericmetaxas.com, you can sign up for my newsletter. You can read several chapters for free, and we lead you to a number of booksellers. So you're not buying it from me, but we lead you to a number of booksellers at ericmetaxas.com.
And I bet a lot of our friends are going to pursue that. We're grateful to you, Eric Metaxas. Thank you for joining the C.S. Lewis Society of California for this great conversation. We hope to see you again.
I hope to be with you again. This was a joy. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.